Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
Winter's embrace had settled upon Torwald Greybeard's manor with all the solemnity of an ancient ritual, and the bitter wind howled through the aged oaks that surrounded the ancestral estate like the voices of long-forgotten spirits. The great hall within the oldest wing of the house shimmered with the light of hundreds of candles in massive silver candelabras, their flames dancing in the cold drafts and casting restless shadows upon the dark tapestries bearing heraldic crests. The air was thick with the aroma of beeswax candles and the faint scent of ancient timber, wood that had been steeped in centuries of stories both glorious and dark. Helga Hufflepuff sat in the front row amongst the invited guests, alongside the other founders of Hogwarts. Her fingers nervously worried the folds of her warm woolen cloak of honey gold, whilst her usually warm brown eyes were filled with a growing sense of foreboding. They had not come here of their own volition. The tale of the defiant elf had spread throughout the wizarding community like wildfire through a drought-stricken forest. What had begun as mere tavern gossip in Diagon Alley had evolved into serious discussions within the halls of the Wisengamot, until finally it had reached the point where Torwald had personally invited the most influential wizards to witness his justice. Godric Gryffindor sat beside her, his hand resting upon the hilt of his sword, an old habit that betrayed his unease. Rowena Ravenclaw thoughtfully fingered the diadem upon her head, her intelligent eyes carefully studying the assembled guests. Salazar Slytherin kept somewhat apart, his face as inscrutable as ever when he found himself amongst those he did not trust. The hall held approximately 50 of the most powerful wizards in the region. Helga recognized some of them amongst the gathering. Here were ancient families, new money merchants, and influential traders alike. All had come to witness this unusual trial, which was intended to serve as an example to any who might dare challenge the established order of their world. The atmosphere was restless. Tension hung in the air like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Conversations were conducted in whispers, but Helga caught fragments of phrases. Impossible. An elf dared to. This must be put to an end. She sensed that this evening would change many things forever. In the center of the hall, upon the cold stone floor, stood a small house elf. Grammel, for that was what he was called, was diminutive even by the standards of his kind. His large, watery eyes, which in elves typically express submission and fear, gazed straight ahead with an unbreakable dignity that contrasted strangely with his tattered appearance. The old gray fabric that served as his clothing was torn in several places, and through the rents could be seen fresh bruises upon his thin arms. His long, pointed ears twitched slightly from the cold, whilst the grayish hair upon his head was disheveled. But the most remarkable thing was that he did not tremble. Not from cold, not from fear. He stood straight as an ancient oak that had weathered many storms and remained steadfast. Grammel, came a cold voice tinged with disgust. Magistrate Torwald Greybeard, a tall and gaunt wizard in sumptuous dark blue velvet robes trimmed with silver thread, paced around the elf like a predator circling its prey. His long gray beard reached almost to the floor, whilst his cold steel-gray eyes blazed with malice. Each of his steps echoed upon the stone floor, creating an ominous rhythm. You stand accused of the most grievous of all sins for your kind, disobedience to your master. Grammel did not flinch. His thin lips were pressed firmly together, whilst in his eyes burned something that might have been called resolve. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse from years of silence, yet firm. Grammel did not repent then. Grammel does not repent now. A wave of murmurs swept through the hall amongst the assembled guests. Lady Malfoy covered her mouth with her pink silk glove. Lord Black furrowed his thick brows, whilst a young witch from the Pruitt family fairly jumped in her seat. Such audacity from a house elf seemed impossible to them. No one had heard the like for entire centuries. Elves were meant to obey, serve, and remain silent. This was law, older than memory itself. Helga felt her heart constrict with a sense of impending doom. She had witnessed enough such trials to know how they typically concluded. Torwald halted before the elf, his face contorted with a grimace of contempt. Insolent creature, you have forgotten what you are, forgotten your purpose. He turned to the assembled guests, his voice becoming louder, more theatrical. Ladies and gentlemen, permit me to remind you of what transpired 3 days past in my household. And Torwald began his account. His words painted a picture of that rainy morning when everything had begun. 3 days earlier, Torwald Greybeard's manor. Rain was drizzling outside, and droplets of water trickled down the leaded window panes of the great dining room. Young Agatha Waite, Torwald's niece, sat at the massive oak table attempting to take her breakfast, but her hands were trembling. She had recently finished her education at Hogwarts and was to spend several months with her uncle whilst her parents arranged her future marriage. Agatha was a delicate girl, far too sensitive for the Waite family, who were renowned for their cruelty. When she inadvertently knocked over a porcelain teacup with her elbow, a work of art worth several hundred galleons, and it shattered upon the floor, her heart stopped with dread. Torwald, who was just entering the dining room, saw the fragments and exploded with fury. "Clumsy fool," he roared, drawing his wand. "That cup was worth more than you shall earn in a year." Agatha shrank back in terror, her eyes filling with tears. "Uncle, I did not mean to. It was an accident." "An accident?" Torwald raised his wand, and red light began to gather at its tip. "I shall teach you to be more careful." Crucio. The red beam flew towards the girl, but did not reach its target. A small figure appeared from nowhere and interposed itself in the spell's path. Grammel, Torwald's house elf, took the curse upon himself. He fell to the floor, writhing in agony, yet did not cry out. Instead, when the spasms began to subside, he slowly rose and looked directly into his master's eyes. "Enough," he said quietly, yet each word rang clearly in the hushed room. "Grammel will not permit harm to come to the young mistress. She has done nothing wrong." Torwald was so shocked that for several seconds he could not utter a word. The elf who had served his family for over a century had never raised his voice, never argued, had always groveled in the dirt. "And now, you dared to step between me and my curse?" whispered Torwald, his voice trembling with rage. "Grammel stepped between the strong and the weak," replied the elf, helping Agatha to her feet. "This is right." "Right." Torwald laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter. "Who gave you the right to decide what is right and what is wrong? You are an elf. You are nothing." Grammel looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Grammel may be nothing to Master Torwald, but Grammel cannot watch whilst the innocent suffer." Torwald concluded his tale and turned to the assembled guests. His eyes blazed with righteous anger. "And here we have the consequences. An elf who dared to challenge his master, who decided that he could judge right from wrong." He looked at Grammel once more. "Tell everyone, creature. Tell them how you dared raise your hand against a wizard." Grammel slowly raised his head, and in his eyes flickered something that might have been called disdain. "Grammel did not raise his hand," he said calmly. Grammel interposed himself. Grammel saw how the young mistress wept, saw how the high wizard wished to hurt her for a broken cup. His voice became quieter, yet each word rang clearly in the silent hall. Grammel said, "Enough." Grammel stepped between them. The silence that fell upon the hall was so thick it seemed it could be cut with a knife. Some of the guests exchanged glances of shock, others frowned with indignation. Helga felt her chest fill with something warm, admiration for the courage of this small creature. "And that is quite enough," exclaimed Torwald, his voice echoing from the vaulted ceiling. "You have forgotten your place, wretched creature. An elf has no right to interfere in wizards' affairs, no right to disobey orders, no right to think. For this there is but one punishment." He drew his wand from the pocket of his robes, and everyone in the hall held their breath. The staff was made of ebony and decorated with silver runes, whilst at its tip a sinister green light was already beginning to gather. Helga found herself rising from her seat quite unexpectedly. Her heart was beating so loudly she was certain the entire hall could hear it. Words flew from her lips before she could think them through. What punishment is there for protecting the innocent? The silence that fell upon the hall was deafening. Even the candles seemed to cease their flickering. Godric Gryffindor frowned and placed his hand upon her shoulder, as though trying to make her sit down again, but Helga remained standing. Rowena Ravenclaw raised an incredulous eyebrow, her intelligent eyes darting between Helga and Grammel. Salazar Slytherin shook his head almost imperceptibly, yet something resembling curiosity flickered across his features. Torwald slowly turned to Helga, his face white with fury, his wand still trembling in his hand. "Lady Hufflepuff," he said in an icy tone, each word falling like a drop of ice. "You do not understand the nature of these creatures. Elves do not protect the innocent. They possess no will of their own, no desires of their own, no thoughts of their own. They exist to serve. If we permit them to believe they can choose whom to serve and how, chaos shall overrun our world. Helga descended several steps, drawing closer to the center of the hall. Her voice, when she spoke again, was quiet yet clear. But what if they can choose between good and evil, Master Torwald? What if this elf consciously chose to protect the defenseless rather than remain blindly obedient? Does this not make him more worthy of respect rather than punishment? Another murmur swept through the guests, but this time it was different. Some nodded, some frowned, whilst others simply stared in amazement at this extraordinary scene. A lady from the Longbottom family quietly remarked to her neighbor, "She speaks truth, if an elf can make moral decisions." But Lord Black sharply interrupted. "Dangerous thoughts. Next they shall demand equality." Torwald raised his hand, demanding silence. "Lady Hufflepuff," he said, his voice carrying notes of condescending indulgence, "your kindness has always been renowned, but now it clouds your judgment. You look upon this creature and see what is not there. A soul, a conscience, morality." He laughed, but there was no joy whatsoever in his laughter. "It is merely imitation, my lady. Elves have learned to copy our emotions in order to serve us better. But within, they are empty." Helga felt her heart racing. But when she looked at Grammel, she saw in his eyes not emptiness, not imitation, but something far deeper. Pain from centuries of humiliation, unbreakable hope for justice, and strangest of all, something resembling gratitude that someone had finally seen in him more than merely a thing. "Perhaps, Master Torwald," she said, her voice ringing in the silence, "precisely because they can choose between good and evil regardless of commands, they deserve our respect rather than abuse." Respect? Torwald no longer attempted to conceal his rage. "For a house elf? Lady Hufflepuff, you speak of respect for property. This creature belongs to me, as my table or my carpet belongs to me." Godric Gryffindor finally could bear no more and rose. His hand still rested upon the hilt of his sword, whilst his face expressed deep concern. "Helga," he said quietly, yet his voice carried to all present, "I understand your feelings, truly I do. But you challenge traditions older than memory. Elves have served wizards for thousands of years. It is the natural order of things." Helga turned to her old friend, and in her voice rang a note of disappointment that pierced him to his very soul. "Natural, Godric? Is it natural to keep an intelligent being in slavery merely because it was born different? Is it natural to punish it with death for protecting a defenseless girl from cruelty?" Rowena Ravenclaw rose from her seat and approached closer. Her intelligent blue eyes studied Grammel carefully, as though she were trying to read an ancient book written in an unknown language. "The question is indeed complex," she said thoughtfully, fingering her diadem, an old habit that revealed her contemplation. "On one hand, we have traditions and laws established by centuries of experience. On the other," she looked at Grammel, and in her gaze was something resembling respect, "this elf has demonstrated morality and courage that not all wizards could show." Salazar Slytherin had remained silent until now, but presently he slowly rose and approached the group. His cold green eyes calmly regarded Grammel, then Helga, then the rest of the assembly. When he spoke, his tone was cold and calculating, as always. "Morality?" He almost savored the word. "In a creature which, according to our ancestors, possesses no soul? Helga, your kindness has always been both your strength and your weakness. It makes you blind to reality." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the hall. "If we begin to treat them as equals, what shall become of our world? What shall happen to the order that holds our society together?" But before Helga could respond, Grammel suddenly spoke. His voice was quiet, yet in the silence of the hall all could hear him. "Grammel does not ask to be equal to the High Wizards," he said, looking directly at Salazar. "Grammel asks only for the right not to remain silent when witnessing injustice. The right to say no when commanded to harm the innocent." Salazar flinched as though the elf had struck him. Something incomprehensible flickered in his eyes. Surprise? Respect? He stared at Grammel for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Interesting," he murmured. "Most interesting indeed." Torwald watched this scene with mounting fury. He saw how his simple plan for public punishment of a disobedient elf was transforming into a philosophical debate about the nature of freedom and dignity. This was intolerable. "Enough!" he roared, raising his wand again. "Enough of these sentimental prattlings. This elf has violated the sacred law of obedience. He has forgotten his place, and now he shall bear the punishment that must serve as an example to all others." The green light at the tip of his wand grew brighter, and all in the hall felt the cold presence of death. Avada, stay your hand. Helga leaped forward and positioned herself between Torwald and Grammel, spreading her arms wide. I take this elf under my protection. Once more, deathly silence fell upon the hall. Even Torwald froze, his wand still raised, the curse half spoken. Your protection? He whispered at last. Lady Hufflepuff, you cannot. I can, Helga interrupted firmly. Her voice did not tremble, though her heart was racing madly. By the ancient right of magical dueling, established by Merlin himself, I may take under my protection anyone I deem unjustly accused. If you wish to harm this elf, first you must get past me. Torwald slowly lowered his wand, his face distorted with rage and unconcealed hatred. You challenge me? For the sake of an elf? I defend a principle, Helga replied calmly. The principle that every being capable of choosing between good and evil deserves a fair trial, not execution for courage. Another murmur swept through the guests, but this time it was different. Some nodded approvingly, some whispered to their neighbors, whilst a young witch from the Weasley family even whispered, "Bravo, Lady Hufflepuff!" Grammel slowly turned and looked at Helga. Upon his somber face, which for centuries had expressed nothing save submission and fear, appeared something he himself could not understand. Surprise, gratitude, and something even deeper. "Why?" he whispered so quietly that only Helga could hear. "Why does the High Witch protect Grammel?" Helga slowly knelt, so that she was at the same level as the elf. Her warm brown eyes met his watery ones, and in that moment something extraordinarily important occurred in the ancient hall of the ancestral manor. For the first time in many centuries, an elf and a wizard looked upon each other as equals. "Because what you did, protecting a defenseless girl from cruelty, was right," she said quietly, yet her words were heard by all in the hall. "And because every being capable of choosing between good and evil deserves a chance to prove their worth." Torwald grimaced as though he had swallowed something bitter. His plans had suffered complete defeat. Instead of a demonstration of cruel justice, he had received a public debate about elves' rights and morality. Instead of fear, he saw in the eyes of some guests something resembling respect for the defiant elf. "Very well, Lady Hufflepuff," he said at last, barely controlled fury ringing in his voice. "Take your creature. But when it betrays you, and it will betray you, for such is their nature, do not say you were not warned. And do not expect assistance from me." He turned sharply and strode from the hall with great steps, his dark blue robes billowing behind him like storm clouds. At the door he paused and turned back. "And remember, all of you," his voice reached every corner of the hall, "today you have witnessed the beginning of the end. When elves begin to consider themselves our equals, when they begin to think instead of obeying, our world shall change forever, and not for the better." With these words he vanished into the darkness of the corridor, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps. The hall began to empty gradually. Guests departed in small groups, animatedly discussing what had just transpired. Helga caught fragments of conversations. "I wonder if elves truly possess souls. My grandmother always said old Tibby was wiser than many humans. But traditions exist for good reason. Perhaps it is time for change?" When the hall was nearly empty, only the founders, a few closest friends, and naturally, Grammel remained. Godric approached Helga, his face expressing a mixture of concern and admiration. "Helga, you have always been the bravest amongst us all," he said quietly. "But are you certain of what you are doing? Torwald is an influential wizard. He has friends in the Wisengamot, connections in the ministry. He will not forget this slight." Helga still knelt beside Grammel, but now she rose and turned to her friend. "I am certain of what is right, Godric, and what is right is protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Rowena joined them, her intelligent eyes studying Grammel with unconcealed interest. "You know, Helga," she said thoughtfully, "this challenges many of our assumptions about the nature of mind and soul. If elves are truly capable of moral judgment, then our entire philosophy requires revision." She crouched beside Grammel and looked carefully into his eyes. "Tell me, Grammel," she said softly, "when you saw the girl weeping, what did you feel?" Grammel started at the unexpectedness of the question. No one had ever been interested in his feelings before. Grammel felt pain here. He placed his hand upon his chest, as though something sharp was piercing within, and Grammel thought that this was wrong. The young mistress had done nothing evil. She was merely careless. Rowena nodded and turned to the others. Empathy, moral judgment, the ability to distinguish right from wrong independent of commands. She paused. If these are not signs of a soul, then what are? Salazar still stood somewhat apart, observing the scene with an unreadable expression. Finally he approached closer, his cold green eyes settling upon Grammel. In my family, elves have served for over 5 centuries, he said slowly, and I have never witnessed anything like this. He paused. But wisdom lies in the ability to change one's mind when new evidence appears. He crouched before Grammel, and the elf unexpectedly did not avert his gaze as his fellows typically did before wizards. Tell me, Grammel, Salazar said quietly, if you could choose any life whatsoever, what would you choose? Grammel remained silent for a long time, as though pondering this complex question. Finally he replied, Grammel would wish to learn, to read old books, to study magic. His eyes lit with unexpected fire. Grammel knows much about old magic, magic that elves used before we became servants. Old magic? Rowena sprang up, her eyes sparkling with interest. Tell us. Grammel glanced timidly at Helga, as though asking permission. She nodded encouragingly. Elves once we could heal not only the body but the soul. Could feel the pain of others and take it upon ourselves. Could. He lowered his voice to a whisper. Could speak with trees, with stones, with the very earth itself. Godric whistled. Ancient nature magic. I have heard of it in legends, but thought it merely tales. Not tales, Grammel shook his head. Grammel remembers. Grammel is old. Grammel has seen times when elves and wizards lived near each other, but not together. When we were partners, not servants. The silence that followed these words was different, not tense, but thoughtful. Each of those present understood that they had become witnesses to something historic. Not merely the protection of one elf, but the possible beginning of a new era. Helga finally spoke, her voice quiet yet firm. Grammel, I cannot restore your past to you. I cannot single-handedly change the entire system. But I can offer you a choice. She paused, choosing her words. You may come with us to Hogwarts. Not as a servant, not as property. As a friend. As one who can teach us what we have forgotten and learn what we know. Grammel stared at her, as though she had just spoken in some completely unknown language. Friend, he stammered. Yes, Helga nodded firmly. Friends help one another, protect one another, and learn from one another. Are you prepared for this? Grammel gazed at her for a very long time. In his large watery eyes different emotions warred. Hope and fear, desire and disbelief that such a thing was possible. Finally he slowly nodded. Grammel will try. And though his face remained serious, in the depths of his eyes flickered a spark of something entirely new. Not submission, not fear, but hope. Godric placed his hand upon Helga's shoulder. You know what, old friend? I believe you have just begun something great. Something that will change our world. Salazar approached Grammel and unexpectedly extended his hand. If you truly know ancient magic, I should like to learn. In exchange, I can teach you to read our books. Grammel looked with amazement at the outstretched hand, then carefully placed his small palm in Salazar's. It was a simple gesture, yet there was something revolutionary about it. A handshake between wizard and elf as equals. Rowena approached last. And I wish to record everything you remember about the ancient times. This history must not perish. Beyond the windows of the ancestral manor the snowfall was intensifying, blanketing the ancient oaks with white. The cold wind howled in the chimneys, and somewhere in the darkness of the corridors Torwald Greybeard brooded upon revenge. But here, in the great hall where an extraordinary event had just taken place, there reigned a strange atmosphere of warmth and hope. Helga approached the great fireplace where the embers still glowed, and stretched her hands towards the flames. Grammel timidly approached and stood beside her, not behind, as befits a servant, but beside, as friends stand. Grammel, she said quietly, gazing at the dancing tongues of flame, tomorrow a new life shall begin. For both of us. Are you ready? Grammel looked into the fire, then at her, then at the 3 other founders who stood nearby. Upon their faces he saw neither contempt nor pity, only curiosity and something resembling respect. Grammel is ready, he said quietly. Grammel thanks Lady Hufflepuff. Thanks everyone. Simply Helga, she smiled. Friends call each other by name. And whilst beyond the windows winter wrapped the world in its cold embrace, within, a new hope was being born. Hope for a world where every being could find their place not by right of birth, but by right of choosing between good and evil. A friendship was born that was destined to rewrite history. And though many trials awaited them ahead, On this night in the ancient hall of the ancestral manor, something important and beautiful began its life. Spring had come to Hogwarts with gentle grace, like a cautious guest who did not wish to disturb anyone. The first snowdrops had pushed through the last remnants of snow in the castle's inner courtyards, whilst the air carried the delicate fragrance of young leaves and sun-warmed earth. Through the tall windows of Helga Hufflepuff's chambers streamed golden morning light, creating warm pools upon the ancient carpets and bookshelves. Yet the atmosphere within the room was far from the idyllic promise of spring. Grammel sat in the furthest corner, pressed against the cold stone wall, as though attempting to merge with it entirely. 3 weeks had passed since Helga had brought him to the castle, yet he still behaved like a cornered creature. His large eyes constantly watched her, with a peculiar mixture of mistrust and hostility that contrasted strangely with the gratitude she had expected from a rescued elf. "Good morning, Grammel," Helga said pleasantly as she entered her chambers with a bouquet of fresh daffodils in her hands. She always endeavored to speak gently to him, yet each time she felt him tense at her words. Grammel muttered something unintelligible in response, not lifting his head. His thin fingers nervously worried scraps of old fabric, the only clothing he possessed. Helga sighed and placed the flowers in a vase by the window. During these 3 weeks, she had begun to understand that rescuing Grammel from Torwald had been merely the first step. Far more difficult was rescuing him from himself, from those walls of mistrust and bitterness he had built around his soul during centuries of humiliation. "I have brought you breakfast," she said, setting a plate of warm rolls and a cup of milk with honey upon the small table by the fireplace. "Grammel is not hungry," he replied curtly, not even glancing at the food. "You did not eat yesterday evening." "Nor the day before," Helga reminded him gently. "Grammel, you cannot survive without nourishment." "Can," he snapped. "Grammel has done so before, when the High Wizard deemed that Grammel did not deserve food." There was such bitterness in his voice that Helga felt her heart constrict. She slowly approached the fireplace and sat upon the carpet opposite the elf, maintaining a safe distance between them. "You are no longer with Torwald," she said quietly. "Here, no one shall punish you with starvation. Never." Grammel finally raised his head and looked at her. In his eyes burned something resembling anger. "And what does the High Witch want in return?" he asked acidly. Grammel knows how this works. First kindness, then demands. What does Lady Hufflepuff want? For Grammel to clean? To cook? To scrub floors? "I want you to be happy," Helga replied simply. Grammel laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter, only bitterness and unconcealed scorn. "Happy? An elf cannot be happy. An elf can only be useful or useless. Grammel was useful for 100 years. Now Grammel is useless." "You are mistaken," Helga said, her voice carrying firm conviction. "You are needed, not as a servant, but as a friend." "Friend?" Grammel laughed again with that same bitter mirth. The High Witch loves that word. But Grammel is not a fool, though he is an elf. Grammel knows that wizards do not befriend elves. Wizards use elves. He rose and approached the window, standing with his back to Helga. In profile, his gaunt face appeared particularly sharp and pained. "Even this kind witch," he continued without turning, "even she did not save Grammel for Grammel's sake. She saved him for herself, to feel good about herself, so that others would say, 'See how noble she is, protecting the little elf.'" The words struck Helga more painfully than she had anticipated. Not because they held no truth, but because they held partial truth. She had indeed felt satisfaction from doing what was right. But was that wrong? "Perhaps it began that way," she said quietly. "Perhaps I thought more of myself than of you at first. But now I wish to help you for your own sake." Grammel turned sharply, his eyes blazing. "For my sake? Why? What is special about Grammel? He is old, ugly, bitter. He does not know how to be grateful, as a good elf should. He does not know how to smile and say yes, mistress, to every word." "Precisely why," Helga replied, rising to her feet. "Because you do not play a role. You are genuine. You show what you feel, not what is expected of you." "And what does Grammel feel?" he asked, taking a step closer. "Does the High Witch wish to know?" Helga nodded, though something in his tone alarmed her. "Grammel feels anger," he said slowly, savoring each word. "Anger at all High Wizards. Anger at what they do to elves. Anger at what we allow them to do." His voice grew louder. "And Grammel feels anger at himself, for being weak, for allowing them to break him." He stopped directly before Helga, his small form trembling with emotion. "And Grammel feels fear. Fear that this kind which will also betray him. that she too will become cruel, that she too will begin to beat Grammel when he disappoints her. The silence that followed these words was heavy and painful. Helga felt tears rising to her eyes. She had never imagined how much pain could be hidden within such a small creature. Grammel, she whispered, I shall never cause you harm. I promise. Promises, he snorted, though his voice no longer held its former sharpness. Grammel has heard many promises. They all break. He turned and slowly returned to his corner. But instead of pressing against the wall again, he sat upon the carpet before the fireplace, closer to Helga than he had ever been. Why does the High Witch not send Grammel away? He asked wearily. Grammel is rude. Grammel is ungrateful. Grammel is a bad elf. Helga slowly sat beside him, carefully maintaining distance. Because I understand your anger and your fear. She gazed into the dancing flames in the fireplace. You know, I too was once angry. Grammel looked at her with surprise. The High Witch. Angry? Yes. When I was younger, I witnessed the strong humiliating the weak, saw the wealthy abusing the poor, and I was very, very angry. She smiled sadly. But then I understood that anger could destroy me from within if I did not find the right use for it. And what did the High Witch do with her anger? Grammel asked quietly. I directed it towards changing the world. Instead of being angry at those who commit evil, I began helping those who suffer from it. She looked at him. Your anger too can become a force for change, Grammel. But first you must allow yourself to trust at least one person. Grammel sat silently for a long time, gazing into the fire. Finally he said quietly, Grammel does not remember how to trust. Then we shall learn together, Helga replied. They sat in silence for several more minutes, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Then Grammel unexpectedly spoke. High Witch, Helga wishes to hear about the old times. This was the first time he had called her by name. Helga felt this was a small but important victory. Very much, she replied quietly. Grammel moved slightly closer to the fireplace. The firelight played upon his somber face, making it seem less sharp and more human. Once, very long ago, elves did not serve wizards, he began, and in his voice appeared notes Helga had never heard before, warmth, nostalgia, something resembling happiness. We lived in forests, in caves, in old oaks. We had our own settlements, our own traditions, our own magic. Tell me about your magic, Helga requested, moving closer. Grammel looked at her, as though assessing whether these secrets were worth trusting to her. Then he slowly extended his hand towards a withered leaf that had fallen from the daffodil bouquet. Watch, he whispered. He carefully took the leaf between his fingertips, and suddenly it became green and fresh again. But this was not merely an illusion. Helga felt a wave of living energy pass through the room, as though spring itself had touched this place. Elves can speak with the living, Grammel explained quietly. Can feel the pain of trees when they are cut. Can hear the weeping of grass when it is trampled. His voice became sadder. But worst of all, we can feel the pain of other beings. Their loneliness. Their fear. Helga suddenly understood. That is why it pains you so to be near me. You feel my uncertainty. My fear of doing something wrong. Grammel nodded. Grammel feels how Helga worries. How she wishes to help, but knows not how. How she fears that Grammel will hate her. And do you? Helga did not finish the question. Grammel will not hate Helga, he said quietly. Grammel feels her kindness. True kindness, not for show. He paused. But Grammel also feels her guilt. Guilt that she lives in warmth and comfort whilst others suffer. Helga shuddered. He was right, she did feel guilt. Guilt for her privileged position, for being able to help only one elf, whilst thousands of others still suffered. Is that wrong? She asked quietly. No, Grammel replied, and for the first time in all this while his voice sounded gentle. It means that Helga has a true heart, a heart that aches for others. He extended his hand again, this time towards a smoldering log in the fireplace. The flame became brighter and warmer, and the entire room filled with a special coziness. In the old times, elves helped all who needed it, not because we had to, but because we wanted to, because we felt others' pain as our own. What happened? Helga asked. Why did everything change? Grammel smiled sadly. War came. Dark wizards attacked our settlements. They killed those who resisted and took the rest into slavery. His voice became firmer. They told us we must serve or die. And most chose service. And you? Grammel was young then. Grammel thought it was temporary, that soon someone would save us. He laughed bitterly. Grammel waited 200 years, then stopped waiting. Helga felt tears rising to her eyes again. She extended her hand towards Grammel but stopped halfway, uncertain whether he wanted touch. Grammel looked at her suspended hand, then at her face. Something in her eyes, understanding, compassion, genuine care, touched something deep in his soul, something he thought he had lost forever. Slowly, very carefully, he extended his small hand and touched her palm. Grammel. Grammel would like to trust Helga, he whispered. And I would like to be worthy of that trust, she whispered in return. They sat thus for several minutes, their hands touching lightly like the caress of a butterfly. It was a simple gesture, yet it held something extraordinarily important. The first true contact between two beings who were beginning to understand each other. Helga, Grammel said quietly, Grammel will tell you a secret. What secret? Elves have not forgotten the old magic. We hide it, pass it to one another in whispers when the masters are not watching. His eyes gleamed. Grammel knows spells that can heal not only body but soul. Knows how to speak with plants, how to sense the mood of stones, how to... He suddenly fell silent, as though realizing he had said too much. Do not worry, Helga said gently. Your secrets shall be safe with me. Why does Helga wish to know about old magic? Grammel asked mistrustfully. Helga pondered her answer. Then she said, because I believe all forms of magic have value. Because I think wizards lost something important when they stopped learning from other magical beings. She looked into his eyes. And because I wish to understand you. To understand what makes you who you are. Grammel gazed at her for a long time, as though trying to peer into her soul. Finally he nodded. Grammel will show Helga. But not today. Today Grammel is tired from talking. Of course, Helga nodded. But before you rest, will you eat at least a roll? For my sake. Grammel looked at the plate by the fireplace, then at Helga. Slowly he rose and took one of the rolls. It was still warm and smelled of honey and cinnamon. For Helga's sake, he said quietly and took a small bite. Helga smiled, the first genuine smile in many days. Outside the window, the sun was gradually setting, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The spring evening promised to be warm and peaceful. In the fireplace, logs crackled quietly, and the room filled with a cozy atmosphere. Grammel finished the roll, and for the first time in 3 weeks, took the cup of milk. Helga watched him, trying not to show how much this gladdened her. Helga, he said when he had finished the milk, Grammel is still very angry, and Grammel is still very afraid. But Grammel will try to be a friend. That is all I ask, she replied quietly. We have all the time in the world to learn. Grammel nodded and, for the first time, did not retreat to his corner, but remained sitting by the fireplace. Not beside Helga, not yet so close, but no longer alone. It was a small step. But sometimes the most important journeys begin with the smallest steps. Outside the window, stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. Spring was taking firm root at Hogwarts, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. And in the warm room, two very different beings were beginning to discover that friendship was not something that came easily, but something worth fighting for. Grammel fell asleep by the fireplace, for the first time in many years without nightmares. And Helga sat nearby, reading a book and occasionally adding a log to the fire so he would not be cold. They were not yet friends, but they were no longer strangers, and that was a wonderful beginning. Summer had bloomed over Hogwarts in all its magnificent splendor, as though nature herself had decided to demonstrate the enchantment of the world at its very finest. The roses in the founders' gardens perfumed the air so sweetly that their fragrance penetrated even the most distant corners of the castle, mingling with the scent of jasmine and lavender. Sunlight poured through the tall Gothic windows in golden streams, transforming each chamber into a small treasury of summer warmth. The air pulsed with the energy of change and new beginnings, precisely that feeling which comes when the world stands ready for true transformation. In Helga Hufflepuff's library, situated in the western tower of the castle, there reigned an atmosphere of concentrated yet joyful work. This was no longer the somber room where a solitary elf had once hidden in corners. Now it teemed with life. Sunbeams fell upon ancient oak tables where dozens of old tomes, fresh parchments, and detailed notes were carefully arranged. The air was rich with the scent of old parchment, quality ink, and faintly, wild honey and dried herbs, which Grammel employed for his magical experiments. At the great round table beside the principal window sat 2 researchers, so absorbed in their work that the outside world seemed to have ceased to exist for them. Here, observe carefully, said Grammel. delicately touching a time-yellowed parchment with his thin but no longer trembling finger. This speaks of the spell Zillilar, the heart that heals. It can mend not merely wounds of the body, but the deepest wounds of the soul, those that do not heal for years. Helga leaned closer, carefully studying the strange symbols that resembled poetic drawings rather than ordinary words. Each rune was exquisite, with flowing lines that seemed to dance upon the parchment. During 4 months of their joint work, she had learned to recognize the basic elements of elvish script, yet this language still remained for her a complex but fascinating mosaic. "And precisely how does it function?" she asked, diligently copying the symbols into her personal journal, which during this time had grown nearly twice as thick. "I understand the basic principles, but the mechanism." Grammel pondered, propping his chin upon his hand, a gesture he had adopted from Helga during these months. In this time he had changed extraordinarily. No longer did he sit huddled in corners, no longer did he cast defensive, cutting remarks, but conducted himself as a true scholar, deeply interested in transmitting knowledge accumulated over centuries. "Grammel shall attempt to explain in words," he said, slowly rising from his comfortable chair, which Helga had specially commissioned from the local carpenter. "But with magic, it is always better to demonstrate than to describe." He approached a small terracotta pot containing a withering flower upon the wide windowsill, victim of a recent drought that had touched even the castle's magical gardens. The flower, once bright yellow, now hung with faded petals, whilst its stem was bent under its own weight. Placing both palms around the pot, yet carefully not touching it, an important detail of elvish magic, Grammel closed his eyes and began to sing softly something extraordinarily melodious in the elvish tongue. The melody resembled the whisper of wind in a young forest, the babbling of a brook over pebbles, the quiet breathing of earth in springtime. Helga watched, enchanted and forgetting everything else in the world. Around Grammel's palms there gradually appeared a soft, warm green radiance, yet this was not the ordinary magical light to which wizards were accustomed. It pulsed in an unhurried, soothing rhythm of heartbeats, as though life itself had taken visible form. Slowly, with infinite tenderness, this radiance began to flow towards the flower, wrapping its stem in delicate threads of light. The flower began to revive, not sharply, not forcefully, but gradually, gently, as though awakening after a long, healing sleep. The petals regained their color, the stem straightened, and in the air appeared a barely perceptible but beautiful fragrance. "Do you see the difference?" Grammel explained quietly, not opening his eyes so as not to interrupt the flow of magic. "Wizard magic commands. It tells the plant, 'Be healthy at once,' and forces it to obey, even if this is painful. Elvish magic asks. It says, 'Do you wish to remember what health and joy are? I shall help you return to your true nature.'" The flower now bloomed in full beauty, its petals gleaming as though they were made of living gold. But most wondrous was that the entire room gradually filled with a special feeling of peace and deep harmony, such as comes after a long rain on a sweltering day, or after reconciliation with an old friend. "This is incredible," whispered Helga, feeling how her own weariness from long hours of study gradually receded. "Why have we wizards never studied this approach?" Grammel slowly opened his eyes, and in them was not only the usual sadness but something new, pride in his heritage. Because most wizards believe they know a better way. Faster, more powerful, more controlled. He returned to the table, his movements now confident, free of their former constraint. But speed and brute force do not always signify true wisdom or lasting results. Helga nodded approvingly, recording her observations and reflections in her journal. During recent months, she had begun to understand the fundamental difference between approaches. Elvish magic was not weaker than wizard magic. It was principally different. More harmonious, more compassionate, more alive, if one might say so. "Grammel," she said thoughtfully, setting down her quill and regarding him with particular seriousness, "I have an idea. What if we attempted not merely to preserve your knowledge, but to combine two approaches? Your ancient wisdom and our modern capabilities." Grammel raised an eyebrow, a gesture he had also adopted from her. "What precisely does Helga have in mind?" "I think of the other elves in the castle," she explained, rising and approaching the window, through which could be seen the inner courtyard where several elves worked in the garden. "Look at them. They still serve us from sunrise to sunset, still fear to raise their heads to look us in the eyes, still live in constant fear of doing something wrong. But what if we showed them that one can live differently? That another path exists?" Grammel sat in silence for a long time, his expression passing through several stages, from curiosity to concern, and thence to open fear. Then he said quietly, almost in a whisper, "Grammel. Grammel is afraid, Helga. If other elves see that Grammel now lives as a true friend of a wizard, rather than as an ordinary servant, they may want such a life too. And then what?" Helga gently encouraged him. "And then the high wizards may become very angry. At them. At Grammel. At Helga." His voice became smaller. "And then everything might become much worse than it was before. Grammel remembers what happens to those who try to change the order of things." Helga turned from the window and placed her warm hand upon his thin shoulder. "But perhaps, Grammel, it will become much better. Much, much better than we can imagine." Their first experiment with expanding the circle they conducted after a week of careful planning. Helga requested 5 kitchen elves to come to her chambers for an important conversation about the future, attempting to make the invitation as unthreatening as possible. 5 small creatures appeared at the appointed time with such terror in their eyes as though they had been summoned to public execution. They stood in the doorway, pressing against one another, their large eyes darting about the room, seeking signs of danger or anger. "Pipsy, Willow, Sprock, Mimi, and Binks," said Helga in the gentlest voice possible, indicating comfortable chairs arranged around a small table by the fireplace. "Please be seated. We shall speak as equals." The elves exchanged glances of undisguised horror. To sit in the presence of a wizard, especially a founder of the school, was not merely impossible. It violated all the sacred rules by which they had lived for centuries. We cannot, most honored mistress," stammered Pipsy, the eldest amongst them, whose age numbered close to 150 years. "We are servants. We stand and listen. This is proper." "Today," said Helga with such firmness as brooked no argument, "you are not servants. Today you are my guests. And guests sit at their host's table." Grammel, who had until this moment stood by the fireplace observing the scene with agitation, slowly approached and demonstratively sat upon one of the chairs. This was the signal, and the remaining elves, though with enormous trepidation and continuous apologetic glances, followed his example. "I wish to propose something entirely new to you," Helga began when all had finally seated themselves. "These past months Grammel has been teaching me ancient elvish traditions, magic, and wisdom, whilst I have been teaching him our modern methods and knowledge. What if we created at Hogwarts a new system? Not slavery, not voiceless servitude, but true, mutually beneficial cooperation." "See cooperation?" whispered Mimi in a barely audible voice, as though the very word might summon lightning from the sky. "Precisely so. Cooperation." Helga leaned forward, her eyes shining with sincerity. "You would continue to perform your work, for I know it brings you satisfaction when executed with love. But for this you would receive not merely food and shelter, but respect, time for rest, opportunity to learn new things." She paused, looking into each of their eyes. "And most importantly, the right to say no if you are asked to do something wrong or harmful." The silence that fell upon the room after these words was so thick it seemed it could be cut with a knife. The elves regarded her with such a mixture of fear, hope, and complete incomprehension, as though she spoke in some entirely alien tongue from another world. Finally Sprock, the youngest amongst them, whose large eyes seemed particularly expressive, whispered very quietly, "And if we say no to a high wizard, we truly will not be punished? Will not be sent away? Will not be?" "Never," said Helga with such firmness that even doubters could not question her sincerity. "I promise you." "And if," Willow stammered, "and if we wish to learn reading and writing? Like true wizards?" "I shall personally teach you," smiled Helga. "And not merely reading and writing, but everything that interests you." "And if," Binks hesitated so long it seemed he might never finish the sentence, "and if we wish to have our own true names, rather than those nicknames which wizards gave us many years ago?" Helga smiled broadly. "Then you may choose any names you like. Names that reflect who you truly are within." Grammel rose from his chair and approached the table, his movements filled with new, unusual confidence for an elf. "Grammel will tell you something important," he said quietly, yet his voice rang clearly in the hushed room. "Grammel will tell you about the old times, about what we elves were before we became servants. You have the right to know your true history, your roots." And he told them. He spoke of elvish settlements in ancient, enchanted forests where every tree knew its name and every flower sang at dawn. He spoke of magic that could heal not merely wounds of the body, but the deepest spiritual traumas. He spoke of times when elves were free, proud of themselves, when they created wonders not from compulsion but from joy. He spoke of how one could live with dignity even whilst helping others, how service could be a choice rather than a burden. When he concluded his tale, many of the elves wept, not from grief or despair, but from some strange, warm relief, as though a long-forgotten but most precious part of their souls had finally awakened after centuries of slumber. We truly may attempt to live anew?" finally asked Pipsy, her voice trembling with disbelief and cautious hope. "Of course you may," Helga nodded firmly. "But remember, changes require time and patience. Not all wizards will understand immediately. There will be those who resist. But together we can show them that the new path is better than the old." The changes in the castle did not occur overnight. They rolled forward gradually, like morning mist that slowly disperses beneath the gentle sun. The other founders, professors, and students required time to grow accustomed to the new system of interaction with elves. And, as Helga had predicted, not all received these changes with understanding or enthusiasm. Professor Mundungus Grimgould, instructor of defense against the dark arts, a gloomy man with thick black eyebrows and a perpetually dissatisfied expression, was particularly vocal in his protests. "Lady Hufflepuff," he said coldly during the weekly faculty meeting, his voice ringing in the assembly hall like the blow of a hammer upon an anvil, "your experiments with elves are creating serious problems for the entire castle. Yesterday a kitchen elf, dared to correct me when I requested that he bring me hot food at 4 o'clock in the morning. And what precisely did he say to you?" Helga asked calmly, not lifting her head from her notes. "He said," Grimgould fairly gasped with indignation, "that at 4 o'clock in the morning the kitchen is closed for scheduled cleaning, and politely offered to bring me food at 6 o'clock when breakfast would be ready. This is absolutely intolerable. Where has it been heard that a servant should dictate to his master when the latter may eat?" Godric Gryffindor, who sat opposite, barely concealed a smile. "That seems entirely reasonable to me, Mundungus. Elves too require sleep and rest. Moreover, fresh food is always more palatable than that which has stood half the night." "But they are elves," exclaimed Grimgould, his face reddening. "Their sole purpose is to serve us. If they begin to think and choose, then who exactly are we?" "Perhaps," interjected Rowena Ravenclaw, raising her voice above the din, "we are those wise enough to recognize the value of different forms of intelligence and experience. You know, the elf Grammel recently taught me an ancient spell for calming the mind before complex research. It works significantly better than any of our traditional methods of concentration." Even Salazar Slytherin, usually the most skeptical towards innovations, was compelled to acknowledge the obvious advantages of the new system. "Though I do not share Helga's complete enthusiasm," he said in a measured tone, "I must admit, my personal elf, Hryn, has begun sharing with me ancient methods of caring for the rarest magical plants. Some of my potions, thanks to his knowledge and experience, have become significantly more powerful and stable. But the greatest and most unexpected resistance came not from the faculty, but from a group of students from ancient aristocratic families, who were accustomed to treating elves not merely as servants, but as living furniture. Young Arnold Malfoy, a sixth-year student with a magnificent blonde mane and an inflated sense of self-importance, was particularly vocal in his protests. "This is against the very nature of things," he shouted in the great hall during one of the meals, attracting the attention of all present. "Elves were created by higher powers specifically to serve wizards. If we allow them to think and choose, what next? Goblins will demand voting rights in our affairs. Centaurs will be able to study at our schools as our equals. And why not?" Helga replied calmly, approaching his table, her voice level but her eyes blazing with firm resolve. "If they are capable of learning and can make their unique contribution to our common world, why not give them such an opportunity?" "Because then there will be no difference between us and them," exclaimed Arnold, his friends nodding approvingly. "Then the entire natural order of things will vanish. Then chaos will overrun the world. And is that necessarily wrong?" Helga asked quietly. "To become equal to those who have something valuable to teach us. To learn something new about the world from those who see it from a different angle." But gradually, very gradually, the atmosphere in the castle began to change for the better. Students with more open minds saw how the elves became happier, how their work improved when performed with joy rather than fear. They saw how Grammel taught young wizards ancient spells and methods of which their professors had never dreamed. The greatest breakthrough occurred at the end of June, when a second-year student, Elizabeth Pruitt, was seriously injured during training flight on a broomstick. She fell from a height of 15 feet, and though the physical injuries were not critical, The girl fell into deep shock and could not stop trembling and weeping. The castle's physician, an experienced healer, did everything possible for her body, but the spiritual trauma proved more persistent. It was then that healer Fizzbop, an elf who assisted in the hospital wing, and who usually merely cleaned and organized equipment, timidly requested permission to employ an ancient elvish healing spell alongside traditional treatment. This could be dangerous, the physician hesitated, regarding the small creature with mistrust. We do not know the precise mechanism of your magic's action. Allow me to try, Helga requested gently but firmly, having rushed over as soon as she heard of the accident. Grammel will supervise and can halt the process if anything goes amiss. The result was simply astounding. Under Fizzbop's gentle, compassionate touches and his quiet elvish songs, not only did Elizabeth's physical wounds heal significantly faster than the most optimistic prognosis had predicted, but most importantly, the girl completely ceased suffering from the nightmares and panic attacks that typically tormented traumatized patients for months yet. Elvish magic had healed not merely her body but her spiritual trauma, restoring her peace and confidence. News of this success rapidly spread throughout the castle, and the attitudes of many students and faculty began to change radically. Even some of the skeptics were compelled to acknowledge the obvious effectiveness of the new approach. At the end of June, when the summer sun was already blazing mercilessly but evenings remained cool and pleasant, Helga organized the first official gathering of what she called the Cooperation Council, a revolutionary group that included representatives of all the castle's inhabitants, founders, faculty, senior students, and for the first time in history, elves. The meeting was to take place in a new room that Helga had specially arranged for such occasions in the eastern tower of the castle. The principal feature of this chamber was a large round table of polished oak, around which stood identical chairs, so that no one sat higher or lower than others, a symbol of equality and mutual respect that was to become the foundation of their new philosophy. When all had assembled, and it was truly an impressive sight, for never before had elves sat at one table with wizards as equal participants in discussion, Helga rose and surveyed this unusual gathering. "Friends," she began, and this very word, addressed to all present without exception, held special significance. "We have gathered here today to discuss our achievements during these months and our common plans for the future. What we are doing at Hogwarts may become an example for the entire wizarding world." Grammel, who now wore not tattered gray fabric but an elegant green waistcoat of fine wool, which Helga herself had sewn for him with her own hands, slowly rose. His posture was no longer hunched and fearful. Now he carried himself with dignity befitting his true nature. "Grammel would like to tell all assembled," he began, his voice ringing clearly and confidently, "that during these months the elves of Hogwarts have begun to remember again who they truly are. Not merely quiet servants hiding in corners, but ancient healers, sages, keepers of knowledge passed down from generation to generation over millennia." Pipsy, who now proudly called herself Starla, because she had always dreamed of stars and the night sky, nodded approvingly. "We have learned to read and write. We are studying our own forgotten history and traditions." She paused, her large eyes shining with particular joy. "And we still help the castle and all who live in it with great love, but now we do so with joy and pride, not fear and humiliation." Tom Bagnold, a fourth-year student who had initially been one of the loudest opponents of change, unexpectedly raised his hand. I would like to publicly apologize to all elves for how I behaved before." His voice trembled with sincere repentance. "Especially to you, Mist." He addressed the elf who had formerly been called Willow, but had chosen this poetic name. "You taught me a spell for mending broken things that even my father, an experienced auror, did not know. Thank you for your patience with my ignorance." Even Professor Grimgould, though very reluctantly and with visible effort, was compelled to acknowledge the obvious. Perhaps this new system does have its advantages." He coughed as though the words came to him with great difficulty. "My morning tea does indeed taste significantly better when brewed with love and care rather than fear and haste." Rowena Ravenclaw rose with a particular gleam in her eyes. "I have conducted a detailed analysis of productivity and quality of work in the castle during these months," she said, unrolling a large parchment covered with charts and figures. "The results are simply astounding. Food quality has improved by 30%, task completion time has decreased by 25%, and the number of errors has nearly halved. But most importantly, the level of life satisfaction among elves has increased fivefold." Helga felt her heart fill with warm joy at these words. "This is wonderful, but figures are only part of the picture. Most important is that we are creating a new type of relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. Salazar Slytherin, who had long sat in silence, finally spoke. Helga, your idea truly makes deep sense, and the results speak for themselves. He paused, his intelligent green eyes surveying the assembly. But I must pose an important question. What will happen when other wizards, beyond the walls of Hogwarts, learn of our radical innovations? Not all in our world will welcome such revolutionary changes. Everyone in the room fell silent, realizing the seriousness of this question. Indeed, what they were doing in the castle was revolutionary, and revolutions always provoke resistance. And here we approach the most important moment, Helga replied, rising and approaching the great window through which could be seen the gardens bathed in the setting sun. We cannot change the entire world in one day, but we can show it that our way works better. We can prove that respect and cooperation yield better results than compulsion and fear. Grammel slowly rose and approached the great window, standing beside Helga. His silhouette against the light of the setting sun appeared not as the figure of a servant, but as the figure of a sage contemplating the future. In the most ancient times, he said quietly, yet so all in the room could hear him, our ancestors had an ancient proverb. A tree that grows alone in a field may be very tall and seem mighty, but during the first true storm it will fall. But a forest where each tree supports its neighbors, where roots intertwine beneath the earth and branches protect one another from the wind, such a forest will stand forever, even during the fiercest hurricanes. He turned to the assembly, and in his eyes was something that might be called the quiet wisdom of centuries. Grammel believes that we here at Hogwarts are beginning to grow just such a forest where every being, be it wizard, elf, or anyone else, has their place, their value, their contribution to the common good. In the room there reigned a special, almost sacred atmosphere, the feeling that those present were witnessing the birth of something truly new and beautiful. Beyond the windows the summer sun was slowly setting, painting the sky in incredible shades of gold, pink, and lavender. Helga returned to the table and extended her hand to Grammel. He, without the slightest hesitation, took her palm in his small but strong hand. Then Godric joined them, followed by Rowena, then Salazar. One by one others joined the circle, elves, students, faculty. A living circle formed in which there were neither masters nor servants, neither higher nor lower, only different beings learning to live in true harmony and mutual respect. Today, Helga said quietly, her words ringing like a solemn vow, we are not merely concluding one stage. We are beginning something far greater. We are beginning to create a world in which every being can realize their unique potential, where cooperation is more important than domination, where wisdom is valued above strength. Beyond the window, stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, like witnesses to this historic moment. The summer night gently descended upon Hogwarts, bringing with it the promise of new possibilities and new discoveries. In the castle a new tradition was being born, a tradition of true respect, deep understanding, and creative cooperation amongst all forms of intelligent life. And though all understood that trials and challenges from those unprepared for such radical changes still awaited them ahead, on this special summer evening in the round room on the eastern side of the castle, the light of hope burned particularly bright and confident. The magic of true equality was beginning its triumphant life, and nothing in the world could stop it. October had arrived at Hogwarts with all its dramatic grandeur, like an ancient bard bearing tales of great trials and unpredictable turns of fate. The castle was wreathed in the wild colors of autumn, the honey gold of mighty maples, the crimson of ancient oaks, the dark red leaves of rowan trees that blazed in the last rays of sunlight like living flame. Yet beneath all this breathtaking beauty lurked an ever-growing sense of unease. The wind howled through the high towers with increasing ferocity and ruthlessness. Clouds gathered on the horizon faster than usual, whilst the very air was charged with the electric tension of approaching momentous changes. In her cozy chambers in the western tower, Helga sat by the fireplace with an open book about ancient protective enchantments upon her lap, yet her thoughts were far from scholarly texts. The pages had remained unread for several hours, her gaze occasionally settling upon the dancing flames as though seeking answers to the questions that troubled her. Beyond the high-arched window swayed the nearly bare branches of a centuries-old oak, and each gust of autumn wind seemed an ominous warning of the approach of something inevitable and perilous. Over the past several weeks, increasingly disturbing rumors had reached her from various corners of the wizarding world. Torwald Greybeard, it transpired, had not simply forgotten his public humiliation on that winter evening in his ancestral manor. On the contrary, he was methodically and persistently gathering allies amongst the most influential and conservative wizards, convincing them that the dangerous experiment with equality for elves at Hogwarts posed a threat to the foundations of their society and must be halted at any cost, down to the last drop of blood. Grammel sat opposite her at a small round table of dark wood, carefully transcribing ancient elvish recipes for healing potions in his neat, practiced hand. During these long, eventful months, he had not merely learned to write in elvish, he had mastered human script as well, and now was creating a unique, invaluable collection of knowledge that harmoniously combined both magical traditions. His concentrated face was softly illuminated by the golden light of the fireplace, whilst his new woolen cloak of deep green, which Helga had sewn for him with her own hands from the finest fabric, gave him the appearance of a true scholar worthy of respect. "Helga," he said quietly, not lifting his head from the parchment, yet his voice was filled with concern. "Grammel senses something very ill in the air, as though a great storm approaches. Not an ordinary autumn storm with rain and wind, but another. Dark, dangerous." Helga set aside her book and regarded her dearest friend attentively. During these months of close collaboration and daily communion, she had learned to trust completely his intuition, that ancient elvish ability to sense even the subtlest magical disturbances and changes in the energy of the surrounding world long before they became apparent even to experienced wizards. "Do you think this is somehow connected to Torwald and his schemes?" she asked, feeling unease creep up her spine with cold fingers. Grammel finally raised his head from his work, and in his large, expressive eyes was deep concern mixed with something resembling fear. "Grammel cannot know precisely what approaches, but something very dark and ancient comes towards the castle, something that reeks of old anger and thirst for vengeance." He set down his quill and slowly approached the great window through which could be seen the somber autumn landscape. "The elves in the kitchen are also very restless these past days. Starla told me she dreams strange, frightening dreams of dark shadows surrounding the castle. Miss says that even the stones in the oldest walls seem tense, as though they remember something terrible from the past." Before Helga could process these troubling words and respond to them, someone knocked upon the massive oak doors of their chambers. But this was not an ordinary, polite knock of a visitor or servant. It was a loud, impatient, imperious knock of one accustomed to receiving immediate response to his demands and tolerating no delay. "Lady Hufflepuff," rang through the thick wooden doors a familiar, unpleasantly cold voice that instantly made the blood in Helga's veins quicken its pace. "Open these doors immediately. I have urgent and most important business with you." Helga and Grammel instantly exchanged glances, and both recognized this voice with horror. Torwald Greybeard had finally come for what he considered his lawful property. Helga drew a deep breath, attempting to calm her heart that beat like a caged bird, slowly approached the doors and carefully opened them. Upon the threshold stood Torwald in his finest dark blue robes trimmed with silver thread, yet this time he was not alone. With him were 3 other wizards, all in dark, almost black cloaks, all with drawn wands at the ready, all with faces expressing a mixture of aristocratic superiority and barely restrained cold anger. "Good evening, Master Torwald," said Helga in as polite a tone as possible, though her heart was racing and her hands involuntarily trembled. "How may I assist you at such a late hour?" "You know perfectly well how, Lady Hufflepuff," Torwald replied coldly and sharply, entering the room without invitation with broad, confident strides. "There is no need to play innocent with me." His companions followed him, their menacing presence instantly filling the cozy space with a sense of danger and tension. "I have come for my lawful property, for the elf whom you treacherously and unlawfully took from me many months ago." Grammel, who had been standing by the fireplace observing the unfolding events, did not flinch nor attempt to hide behind Helga, as other elves might have done. Instead, he proudly straightened, squared his shoulders, and looked Torwald directly in the eyes, a gesture absolutely impossible for a submissive servant, yet natural and proper for a being conscious of its own dignity and worth. "Grammel is not Master Torwald's property," he said calmly yet firmly, each word ringing clearly and unshakably. "Grammel has long since ceased to be a servant. Grammel is now a friend to Lady Helga and a free being." One of Torwald's companions, a tall, gaunt wizard with a long scar crossing his entire face from temple to chin, fairly spluttered with indignation. "Do you hear this blasphemy? The wretched creature speaks to us as though it were equal to high wizards. This is intolerable. Precisely what I have been trying to explain to you all along," said Torwald, his cold steel eyes boring into Helga. Your reckless experiments with equality have gone too far, Lady Hufflepuff. You have irreparably corrupted my valuable property, taught it disobedience and unseemly manners. Now I demand the return of what belongs to me by ancient right of mastery. Grammel has never belonged to anyone and never shall, Helga replied firmly yet without aggression, taking a step forward and symbolically positioning herself between Torwald and her friend. He is a free, intelligent being who has the unquestionable right to choose his own life and destiny. Torwald laughed loudly and contemptuously, yet there was not a hint of joy or merriment in his laughter, only cold, cutting mockery. A free being? A house elf? He turned theatrically to his companions, spreading his arms. Ladies and gentlemen, see to what such harmful, destructive ideas lead. Soon these creatures will demand voting rights in the Wisengamot. They will want their own houses, their own wands. At this tense moment the chamber doors burst open, and the other founders of Hogwarts swiftly entered, evidently drawn by the unusual commotion and the sensation of magical tension spreading through the castle. Godric held his famous sword gleaming in the firelight, Rowena gripped her ancient wand adorned with runes, while Salazar with his cold, penetrating green eyes carefully assessed the situation, instantly understanding the full gravity of what was transpiring. What is happening here, Torwald? Godric asked, his voice firm, unwavering, and brooking no evasion. Why have you intruded upon our castle with armed companions? I am merely reclaiming my lawful property, Gryffindor, Torwald replied with feigned calm, yet his eyes blazed with malevolent fire. And I warn you all, founders of this school, your dangerous games with equality between species must cease immediately. If you do not stop voluntarily. If not, what precisely do you intend to do? Salazar interjected, taking a careful yet expressive step forward, his hand also resting upon his wand. Torwald smiled with a cold, sinister smile that boded nothing good. Then I shall be compelled to take decisive measures to halt this disorder. He made a theatrical pause. I have the complete support of the most influential and ancient families of the entire wizarding world. We are united in our resolve not to permit one sentimental, yet short-sighted woman to destroy forever the sacred foundations of our society. Grammel will go with Master Torwald, the elf suddenly said, his words ringing like thunder amidst clear skies. All present turned to him in absolute shock and undisguised horror. Helga felt her heart painfully constrict, whilst her breathing momentarily stopped from surprise and pain. Grammel, no, she exclaimed, unable to hide the despair in her voice. You need not do this. We shall find another way. Grammel will go with Master Torwald, he repeated calmly, yet then added something that fundamentally changed the meaning of his words. But not as a submissive servant or property. Grammel goes to show Master Torwald once and for all what true strength and true magic truly mean. Something in his tone, some special, ancient confidence and resolve, frightened even Torwald himself, though he attempted not to show it. But pride and anger would not permit him to retreat or doubt himself. I care not what foolish thoughts you harbor as you come with me, pitiful creature. Important only is that you finally return to where your sole proper place lies, beneath my feet. The next 2 hours passed in tense, feverish preparation for the inevitable confrontation. Torwald and his 3 companions demonstratively established themselves in one of the finest guest chambers in the Eastern Tower, clearly intending to remain in the castle all night and showing no haste to depart. The founders urgently convened a council and deliberated in Godric's study until deep into the night, attempting to find a legal means to oppose Torwald's demands. Meanwhile, Helga desperately tried to persuade Grammel not to go, not to sacrifice himself for others. You simply do not understand the entire situation, my dear Helga, Grammel said gently yet immovably, carefully folding his meager possessions into a small bag. Grammel must do this, not for Master Torwald's sake and not because he fears him. Grammel does this for all other elves in the world, for the future. If Grammel does not return to him voluntarily, Master Torwald will surely find means to cause irreparable harm to Helga and all the good we have created together here. But you can remain here forever, Helga insisted, tears already rising to her eyes. We shall all protect you together. We have sufficient strength and authority. Grammel approached her and very tenderly, like an elder brother, took her trembling hands in his small yet strong and warm palms. My dear Helga has taught Grammel the most important truth, that true friendship means being prepared to protect those you love and respect. Even if it costs dearly, even if one must sacrifice something very important. Suddenly, the entire castle shook from some unnatural tremor. But this was not an ordinary earthquake or natural disaster. It was something far worse and more terrible. Cracks of pulsing dark light ran along the ancient stone walls, whilst the air instantly filled with a heavy, putrid smell of sulfur, old iron, and something unspeakably ancient and evil. "Merciful heavens, what is this?" exclaimed Helga, rushing to the window and peering outside. Beyond the window the sight was horrifying. The night sky had taken on an unnatural, ghastly greenish hue, whilst around the castle's high towers circled thick dark shadows that resembled enormous coiled serpents of black smoke. The air seemed thick and heavy, whilst within it rang barely audible, yet all the more horrifying moans and whispers. "An ancient curse of retribution," whispered Grammel, his face instantly becoming white with horror and recognition. "Grammel has read of such things in the oldest, most terrible books. This is a spell from the times of the Dark Wars, when wizards warred against each other. It binds the souls of all living beings to a certain place and slowly, tortuously drains them." The chamber doors burst open with a crash, and Torwald entered confidently. Now his face blazed with malevolent, triumphant joy, whilst in his eyes danced flames of madness. "I hope you are enjoying my little demonstration of true strength and capabilities," he said with cruel pleasure in his voice. "This is one of the most ancient and powerful spells from the times of the dark magical wars. It will slowly but inexorably drain the life force from the entire castle and all who dwell within, until I receive what belongs to me by right." "You are mad," exclaimed Godric, rushing into the room alongside the other founders, the sword in his hand gleaming with magical energy. "Hundreds of innocent people live here. Students, children. Then perhaps you had better hasten with the correct decision," Torwald replied coldly and indifferently, savoring his power over the situation. "The longer you delay in returning my property to me, the weaker and more helpless all inhabitants of this castle become." And indeed, Helga already felt a strange, unnatural weariness growing with each minute and spreading throughout her entire body. Everything around her gradually seemed to be covered with a gray, colorless veil. Breathing became increasingly difficult, whilst thoughts became confused and lost their clarity. "Grammel will go with Master Torwald right now," the elf said firmly and resolutely. "Remove this terrible curse from innocent people immediately." "First the curse must complete its work," Torwald smiled with cruel joy. "It will vanish only when we are far from this accursed place, and no one will be able to attempt taking you from me again." But Grammel did not go to the doors as everyone expected. Instead, he resolutely approached the very center of the room and knelt upon the cold stone floor, placing both palms upon the stone and closing his eyes. "What are you doing, Grammel?" Helga asked with growing alarm. "Grammel will use the most ancient magic of our people," he replied, not lifting his head nor opening his eyes. "Magic that even the most learned wizards have long forgotten. But this will cost very, very dearly." "No!" Torwald sharply interrupted, suddenly understanding that he was losing control of the situation. "I categorically forbid you to use any magic without my special permission." He quickly raised his wand, directing it at the elf, yet Grammel had already begun to sing. This was not the melodious, soothing song that Helga had heard from him during plant healing. This was something far more ancient, powerful, primordial, and simultaneously terrifying. The words sounded like the very voice of the ancient earth finally awakening after millennia of slumber and preparing for battle. Around the elf's figure, light gradually began to appear, at first barely perceptible, then ever brighter. But this was not the soft green radiance of his previous magical acts, but brilliant, almost blinding white light that pulsed with incredible, almost cosmic force. "What is he doing?" "Stop him!" exclaimed one of Torwald's companions, raising his wand. "He is using his own life force." Rowena replied with undisguised horror in her voice, instantly understanding the essence of what was occurring. "He is expending his own life to break the ancient curse." The light around Grammel grew ever brighter and more powerful, filling the entire room with unearthly radiance, yet he himself became ever weaker and paler. His small body trembled from the colossal strain he was enduring, whilst from his large eyes flowed an unending stream of tears of pain and despair. "Grammel, cease immediately," Helga cried, attempting to approach him, yet the light was too intense, too powerful for anyone to draw near. "Grammel must do this," he said through unbearable pain, each word costing him tremendous effort. "For all friends. For a just future. For love." And in that very moment the light exploded with incredible force, filling not merely the entire room, not merely the entire tower, but the entire vast castle with incredibly bright, purifying radiance. For an instant it seemed that the very sun had risen directly in Helga's chambers, banishing all darkness and evil from the world. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, all fell silent. The curse vanished without trace. The dark shadows beyond the windows instantly dispersed as though they had never existed. The sky regained its ordinary, peaceful nocturnal hue, whilst in the air, instead of the heavy smell of sulfur and evil, there reigned the light fragrance of autumn leaves and freshness. But the terrible price of this victory was that Grammel now lay upon the cold stone floor, absolutely motionless and deathly pale, as though all color, all life force had departed his small body along with that powerful magic he had released for everyone's salvation. Grammel! Helga rushed to him, carefully lifting his lifeless head onto her knees. Grammel, please speak to me. His eyes very slowly, with great effort, opened, yet in them was no longer their former liveliness and fire. Helga! Grammel is happy that he could help his friends. Do not speak such things. Tears streamed endlessly down her cheeks. You shall live. We shall certainly find a way to save you. Torwald stood over them, his face absolutely bewildered, shocked, and completely disoriented. He risked his own life. For you. For all of you. For those he does not even know. Yes, said Helga, not taking her gaze from the weakening Grammel. Precisely because such is true friendship. Such is true service, not from compulsion or fear, but from boundless love and self-sacrifice. Grammel weakly yet still squeezed her hand. Grammel regrets nothing. Grammel was able to save his dearest friends. This is right. This is the only possibility. Suddenly Fizzbop, an experienced healer elf from the hospital wing, rushed swiftly into the room, dragging behind him a large leather bag with various herbs, bottles of potions, and magical instruments. Quickly! Immediately! He cried, his usually calm voice trembling with agitation. Fizzbop knows what happened. Grammel used the forbidden spell of self-sacrifice from the most ancient times. But Fizzbop has read of this in secret books. Fizzbop knows how to help. The following 2 hours passed in absolutely feverish, desperate work for Grammel's life. Fizzbop, actively assisted by the extraordinarily intelligent Rowena, and, most surprisingly of all, even Torwald himself, who unexpectedly proved to be an expert in the most complex aspects of both dark and healing magic, fought for every heartbeat, for every breath of their patient. They masterfully employed both the most ancient elvish potions and decoctions and the most modern wizard healing spells, harmoniously combining two radically different approaches to magic precisely as Helga had taught them during these revolutionary months. Helga sat beside the bed to which they had moved Grammel, firmly holding his cold hand and continuously whispering words of support and love to him, attempting with her voice to call him back from darkness to light. Salazar and Godric alternated magical spells to maintain life forces, whilst other elves of the castle, Starla, Mist, and even the smallest amongst them, brought rare herbs and roots that might aid in this battle for life. Gradually, very slowly yet steadily, natural healthy color began to return to Grammel's deathly pale face, whilst his breathing gradually became deeper and more regular. He will live, Fizzbop finally said, wiping sweat from his brow with his small paw and collapsing from exhaustion onto a chair. Grammel will live, but he requires very long rest and complete peace. His soul traveled very far to save us all. Torwald had sat all this while in the furthest corner of the room, watching this incredible scene of salvation with an expression of complete amazement mixed with something resembling sincere repentance. His confidence and superiority had vanished somewhere without trace, leaving only an old, weary man who had suddenly seen the world through entirely different eyes. Finally he found voice to speak, his tone quiet and barely audible. I simply cannot comprehend. Why did he do this? I truly wished to take him back to myself, compel him to serve as before, yet I never intended to kill him or cause such harm. He did this not because he was compelled, not because he feared you, Helga said quietly yet with absolute conviction, still not releasing her friend's hand. He did this because he himself chose to, because he boundlessly loves this place and all the people who live within it. Here lies what fundamentally distinguishes a submissive servant from a true, faithful friend. Torwald sat in complete silence for a long time, pondering these words and attempting to grasp their profound meaning. Then slowly, as though each movement cost him great effort, he approached the bed where Grammel lay. I sincerely apologize to you, he said, these simple words evidently costing him tremendous, almost inhuman difficulties. I did not know, did not understand, did not wish to see the truth. Grammel slowly opened his eyes and smiled weakly yet sincerely. Grammel sincerely forgives Master Torwald. Grammel understands. We all learn throughout our entire lives. It is never too late to comprehend truth. Can you find strength within yourself to teach me? Torwald asked unexpectedly, even to himself. To teach me to understand the true value of every living being? Grammel will most gladly teach Master Torwald all that he knows, the elf replied, his voice weak yet filled with sincere kindness. But first Master Torwald must learn the most important thing, to listen to others. Truly, with all his heart, to listen. Torwald nodded deeply, his former pride and superiority finally completely broken before the face of true human courage, selfless sacrifice, and all-forgiving love. I am ready to learn, he said quietly. Ready to change. Beyond the great arched windows the autumn storm was gradually subsiding, gusts of wind becoming weaker and gentler, whilst the first bright stars appeared one by one in the cleansed, peaceful sky. The terrible trial had finally ended, yet it had made their friendship not merely stronger. It had elevated it to an entirely new, higher level of mutual respect and understanding. Starla and Mist brought warm blankets and aromatic tea with healing herbs for all present. Fizzbop carefully checked Grammel's pulse and remained satisfied with the results. The founders of the school quietly consulted about how best to organize care for Grammel in the coming days. And in the center of all this caring bustle, in the warm, cozy room where the best of friends carefully watched over one another, there gradually was born a new, even greater hope. Hope that even the most determined opponents, even the cruelest hearts, could radically change and see clearly when they witnessed the true strength of selfless love, faithful friendship, and readiness for self-sacrifice for others. On this quiet autumn night, when the first frost touched the window panes whilst the last glowing coals crackled in the fireplace, a true miracle occurred within the ancient walls of Hogwarts. The miracle of transforming hostility into understanding, anger into compassion, and contempt into deep respect. Though all understood that new challenges and difficulties still awaited them ahead, on this special night the light of hope, goodness, and mutual forgiveness burned particularly bright and inextinguishably in their hearts. Winter had returned to Hogwarts with gentle, almost maternal tenderness, like an old friend bringing with her peace and wisdom after turbulent trials. Beyond the windows of Helga's chambers, snow fell softly, not the stinging, bitter snow of fierce blizzards, but fluffy and soothing flakes that wrapped the ancient castle in a white mantle of silence and serenity. In the fireplace, oak logs crackled peacefully, their golden light dancing upon the walls and creating an atmosphere of profound coziness and safety. 2 months had passed since Grammel had nearly sacrificed his life for the salvation of the entire castle. During this time he had not merely recovered completely in body, but had undergone a spiritual transformation. Now in his eyes was a special wisdom that comes only to those who have stood upon the threshold between life and death and returned with deep understanding of existence's true values. On this quiet winter evening they sat opposite one another by the fireplace, Helga in her favorite armchair with soft cushions, whilst Grammel occupied a new chair specially crafted for him from the finest oak, which Godric had carved with his own hands. Between them upon a low table lay a stack of parchments, drafts of what was to become the most important document in the history of their friendship. Grammel, Helga said quietly, setting aside her quill and gazing at the dancing tongues of flame, I believe we are creating something truly significant. Not merely rules for our castle, but a covenant for all future generations. Grammel nodded, his fingers carefully touching another sheet of parchment. Grammel feels this too. What we write is not merely words. This is a dream of a world where every being may live with dignity. During these months following the terrible trial, radical changes had occurred within the castle. Torwald Greybeard had not only publicly apologized for his actions, but had become one of the most ardent supporters of the new philosophy of equality. He often traveled to Hogwarts to learn from Grammel the wisdom of compassion and understanding. His example had inspired many other influential wizards to reconsider their attitudes towards elves and other magical creatures. Read me the first principle once more, Helga requested. Grammel took the uppermost sheet and began to read in his now confident, melodious voice. The first principle of justice. Every being capable of feeling pain and joy deserves respect regardless of their origin, appearance, or magical abilities. No creature should exist solely to serve another. Beautiful, Helga whispered. And the second? The second principle of understanding. True strength lies not in compulsion, but in mutual cooperation. He who can listen and learn from others becomes wiser than he who merely commands. They continued working upon the document that would later become known as the Hufflepuff Covenant, a revolutionary ethical code defining the treatment of all living creatures in the wizarding world. Each principle had been carefully considered, each word weighed, so as to transmit to future generations the wisdom gained through struggle, suffering, and finally, understanding. The third principle of compassion, Grammel continued reading. True service is born of love, not fear. He who helps others with joy in his heart brings benefit both to himself and to the world. And the fourth is my favorite, Helga smiled. The fourth principle of friendship. The strongest alliances are forged between those who see in another not a servant or master, but an equal friend, capable of both teaching and learning. Suddenly there came a gentle knock upon the door. Helga went to open it and saw upon the threshold all three founders, Godric, Rowena, and Salazar. In their hands were scrolls of parchment. "We have come to formally sign the covenant," said Godric with a sincere smile. "If you are prepared." "More than prepared," Helga replied, inviting them to the fireside. The following hour passed in solemn ceremony of signing. Each founder not only placed their name beneath the document, but added their own thoughts about the future of the school and the entire wizarding world. Godric wrote, "True courage lies in defending the weak and in the readiness to change unjust traditions." Rowena added, "Wisdom without compassion is merely empty erudition. True knowledge includes understanding of the heart." Salazar, after long contemplation, inscribed, "Ambition must serve the common good, not merely personal interests." And Helga concluded, "The greatest treasure is friendship between different beings, united by common values." When the ceremony ended, the founders departed, leaving Helga and Grammel alone with their thoughts and plans. "Grammel," said Helga when they had settled once more by the fireplace, "I wish to propose a new role for you in our school." Grammel raised his eyebrows in surprise. "What role?" "I want you to become the official counselor for compassion and understanding, keeper of ancient knowledge and traditions, teacher of wisdom for future generations." Grammel remained silent for a long time, then quietly asked, "And what would this mean?" "It would mean that you would never again be a servant. You would be an equal partner in all school affairs. You would have your own study, your own students, your own important mission." Helga leaned forward. "But most importantly, you would help other elves find their path to freedom and dignity." Grammel felt tears rising to his eyes. Grammel accepts this honor, but not for himself, for all those who do not yet know that life can be different. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the quiet crackling of logs and the whisper of wind beyond the window. Snow continued to fall gently, creating the sensation that the entire world was wrapped in peace and tranquility. "Helga," Grammel finally said, "Grammel wishes to tell you an ancient elvish legend." "Tell me," she replied with interest. "Once, in the most ancient times, when the world was young, all beings lived in harmony. Not because they were identical, but because each valued the uniqueness of others." Grammel gazed into the fire. But then came pride, and beings began to think that some were better than others. Wars began, discord, suffering. And what happened next? The legend says that one day there will appear a new generation of beings who will again learn to see beauty in diversity. They will create new laws based upon love, not fear. Grammel smiled. "Grammel believes that you and he are part of this new generation." Helga felt warmth spreading through her heart. "I think so too. And you know what? I am certain that our covenant will outlast us. That hundreds of years hence, students will still be studying these principles. And most importantly," Grammel added, "they will live by them." Beyond the window, the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the snowy clouds. The long night of contemplation and planning was drawing to a close, yet their joint mission was only just beginning. "Grammel," said Helga, rising and approaching the window, "look. A new day is beginning." Grammel joined her, and together they watched the sun rising above the snow-covered battlements of the castle. "A new day for a new world," he said quietly. "For a world where friendship is stronger than prejudice," she added, "where love conquers fear, and understanding vanquishes ignorance." They stood side by side, two friends who had traveled a long journey from mistrust to mutual respect, from conflict to harmony. Ahead of them lay great work, to teach the world what they themselves had discovered, that true magic lies not in spells and wands, but in the ability to see another as an equal, to love despite differences, and to sacrifice oneself for the common good. The sun rose higher, its rays transforming the snow into diamonds and the castle into a fairy tale palace. Yet the brightest light came not from the sky, but from the hearts of two friends who knew they had created something eternal, something that would change the world forever. In the warm chambers where the fire still blazed in the hearth, whilst upon the table lay the Hufflepuff Covenant signed by all the founders, a legend was being born. A legend that true friendship can overcome any obstacles, and that one small act of kindness can kindle the flame of change throughout an entire world. And when students of future generations read this story, they will remember. The most important magic is the magic of an open heart and the readiness to see a friend where others see only a stranger. But the tale was not yet complete. As dawn broke fully over Hogwarts, Grammel turned to Helga with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries. "There is one more thing Grammel must tell Helga," he said softly. "In the old tongue of my people, there is a word, Melon and Galar. It means friend in times of darkness. But its deeper meaning is this: a friend who sees light in you when you cannot see it in yourself." Helga felt her eyes moisten with tears of profound gratitude and understanding. "You have been my Melon and Galar, Grammel, and I pray I have been yours." "More than Grammel could ever have dreamed," he replied. "And now, together, we shall be this for others." Outside, the castle was awakening. Students would soon be stirring in their dormitories, elves, no partners, would be beginning their chosen work with dignity and joy, and professors would be preparing lessons that now included the wisdom of many traditions, not just one. The transformation they had begun would spread far beyond these ancient walls. Other schools would adopt similar covenants. Other wizards would question old assumptions. Other friendships would bridge the gaps between different magical beings. In years to come, when historians wrote of this time, they would call it the Great Awakening, the period when the wizarding world remembered that magic was not about power over others, but about the bonds that connect all living things. But for now, in the gentle light of a winter morning, two friends sat by their dying fire, planning lessons for the day ahead. Grammel would teach young wizards about the healing properties of moonbeam moss, whilst Helga would instruct them in the art of listening, truly listening, to those different from themselves. The new covenant lay between them, its ink barely dry, its words destined to echo through the centuries. And in that moment, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of a castle waking to a changed world, they knew that they had given future generations the greatest gift of all. The knowledge that every being, no matter how small or different, carries within them a spark of something magnificent. And when those sparks are allowed to shine together, they can illuminate the entire world. As the morning sun climbed higher in the winter sky, Helga Hufflepuff and Grammel, keeper of ancient wisdom and counselor for compassion, began another day in their lifelong mission to prove that the most powerful magic of all is simply this: to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, the sacred in the everyday, and the friend in the stranger. The last elf was no longer alone, and neither was anyone else who entered the halls of Hogwarts, where every being was valued, every voice was heard, and every heart could find a home.